Where were you in 1968, Mitch?
So is 68, what was I, a junior in high school? And when I think back on it, and like when I did events around my book on May 68, I would always lay out what it was like to live in America and to have some kind of political conscience in 1968. The year begins with Eugene McCarthy running against Johnson. And I must have been interested in that for about 20 minutes because I still have a McCarthy button. It's up there with all my Black Panther stuff and armed struggle stuff. I still have one McCarthy button. I can't imagine why I would have supported him, but actually, so that just shows that at the beginning of 68, I was really just beginning to feel my way politically, to be, in opposition to whatever, but just vaguely. And, then you have that spring was just crazy with Martin Luther King being killed, Bobby Kennedy being killed. And so if that's not going to wake you up politically, I don't know what will. And, even buried in the bowels of Brooklyn the way I was, that stuff reached us. But the first thing that really struck me was the events at Columbia I think it was April of 68. And the coverage was just awful. My parents read the Daily News. It was a tabloid. It was really right wing. But I was so hated the world that I lived in at that point. If the last time we spoke, I gave this kind of, it sounded like an idyllic picture of growing up, in Brooklyn where I did. And it was when I was young and all I was concerned about was stickball, stoop ball, and the Houston Colt 45s. But as I got older, I grew to so intensely, so all-consumingly hate everything and everybody around me. And just the smugness, the lack of interest in anything, the closed-mindedness, the racism, it was just the racial egotism. Every Jew was better than everybody else. Something I've kind of come back to believing myself, but nevertheless, facts is facts. There's really nothing I can do about it. So you should keep so in any event, but I so hated everything that I read all the coverage of Columbia backwards or in reverse. So if the students at Columbia were awful people, destructive and everything, that worked for me. And if you look at, the people, at Columbia, so many of them, and then, of that period in the left, so many people were from the same type of background as me. Mark Rudd, who led SDS at Columbia, was a Jewish kid from the Jersey suburbs. And I'm sure that hatred of being a Jewish kid from the Jersey suburbs was one of the motivating factors in driving him ultimately to the Weather Underground. So I just hated it. So Columbia was a big deal. And I even remember having a discussion about Columbia with one of my teachers. And, he obviously was opposed to the students, but, he explained to me some of the issues. But like I said, it was really the destructive, the anti element that really got to me. And then, so I'm really beginning to feel my way there. And this kind of pushes me to the left, whatever that meant. And then shortly thereafter was May 68 in France. And that was like the final and ultimate tipping point. Because, I remember distinctly, I grew up in a very typical American household. So the TV was on, like from the moment we got up in the morning, even though we were going to school, the TV is on, it's 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, already it's on. So everybody's getting ready to go to school, the TV's on. And I remember, because we're so far behind France, that seeing the footage of what was going on either that day or the previous day in France. And this was it. This was exactly what I wanted. So here were young people rising up to destroy a world to tear down a world that they hated. And I completely and totally identified with them. And that was the beginning of my Francophilia. So it started with politics. And, so Daniel Cohn-Bendit and all that, all the leaders of May 68 in France. And for some reason, I have no idea how it happened. The person who, I can't even imagine where I would have come across him, was Alain Krivine, the leader of the Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire, the Trotskyists. He was my first political hero. Wasn't Che, wasn't Lenin, wasn't Mao. It was, of all damn people, Alain Krivine. I was unlikely to carry that. And like when I interviewed him for my May 68 book, I told him that. And I still have my first political button from the left is a button from the Young Socialist Alliance, the youth branch of the Socialist Workers' Party, with a hammer and sickle, the emblem of the Jeunesse Communiste Révolutionnaire, saying support the French Revolution. So this really just pushed me over. So May 68 and all the events in 68 really were what pushed me into politics. And then I started going to anti-war demonstrations, but all of it, I have to say, the motivating factor, I can't say that I didn't grow up in a left-wing household. I wasn't reading left-wing books yet, but I was really motivated by hatred of everything that I knew. So that was where I was in 68.
So then you went to college? What sort of college did you end up in?
So I was, I said when we spoke last, Andy, that I was like the smartest kid in the class, but then I kind of hit the skids when I was just one smart kid among many. High school, I didn't really show up very often. And it was reflected in my average and in my SAT scores. And at the time, New York, there was never any question but that I was going to a city school. My parents they didn't have money. They weren't going to pay to send me away to school. Never even occurred to me to take out a loan. So I went to community college, even further into the bowels of Brooklyn. On the beach, actually. It was I think it was a merchant marine base and a Coast Guard base that was converted into a community college. But it was full of people like me, smart kids who just never showed up for high school because, other people were getting stoned. All I wanted to do was just not go to school because I hated school. It was one of the many things that I hated. But by the time I got to college in September of 69, I had already started. At that point, I was reading. I'd been reading for like a year. And I've been a thorough pain in the ass in my senior year in high school, spouting whatever Marxism I thought was Marxism, my economics class. But I was, it impressed the teachers. Anyway, when I get to this community college, I went immediately, they had clubs, student clubs. So I went to SDS. There was no way I wasn't going to do it. I was going to be like the Lenin of South Brooklyn. And I'll never forget the first meeting. It was packed, but there were all kinds, and this is a true story. I'm not making this up. Actually, I can't believe I actually said stuff like this. And so there were people at this meeting of SDS who were discussing, because there was no liberal organization on the campus. SDS was all there was. And so all these people went and they said, SDS has a bad name. So what we need to do is we need to change the name of the organization here at Kingsborough. And I said, let me remind you about what Lenin said in April of 1917. And I really said that. I mean, there I am, this pathetic little scrawny Jewish kid in Brooklyn spouting Lenin to save SDS at the school. So anyway, and I did. We didn't change the name, and while I was there, I was really active politically. And in October 15th, 1969 was the moratorium, which was a really huge event. It shows up in most histories of the anti-war movement. And the idea was to shut down every college in America. And I was one of the organizers of the event, so I managed to get all kinds of really high-level speakers like Stanley Aronowitz, members of the Black Panther Party. We had a couple of communists. We had people from the Socialist Workers' Party. And all of them came, I have to say, especially Aronowitz, I remember this specifically, under false pretenses, or with a misunderstanding of what they were coming to, because it was a community college. And everybody assumed, all these people, leftists coming, well, it's community college, it's working class. So we have to, this is our chance, we can talk to the working class. It was full of just like washout middle-class Jewish kids who, had never been any closer to a worker than like 4 zip codes away, if that close. But they all came because they thought they were talking to the working class. But we had a great event. And so I was really active, in SDS, and then we had, we even, because this was, America, and this was 1969, 1970, believe it or not, colleges in the city university system in New York were free, absolutely free. You only had to pay a registration fee. And so my entire college education, I don't think it cost me $500. Took me 5 years to get out. So for all those years, that was all I had to pay in total, not 1 year in total. But while I was when I was a freshman, there was talk of charging tuition. Well, there's only one thing you could do if you're a student in 1969 or 1970. And so, of course, we occupied the school. And we occupied the president's office. We did all this stupid stuff that was, it was all the theatrical stuff, the performative leftism of the 60s, even on the beach in Manhattan Beach, a former resort, a former base, we were still playing like we were on the barricades in Paris in 1968, because this, you have the image. But what was different was, so I was having a blast. The revolution, everybody else was sitting around in the lounge, strumming their guitars, singing Judy Blue Eyes. And I would do some of that. And then the people go sit outside and they would, smoke pot or whatever, but I didn't. I never did, because the revolution was a week from Thursday. So I had to be ready for it. So I couldn't be doing drugs. What if I'm stoned and the working class takes power? The Lenin of East 54th Street isn't going to be there. God knows, what kind of deviation there's going to be. And so I was really believing all this stuff. I was reading, magazines from China. I was reading Trotskyist stuff, anarchist stuff. The world was about to change. It was all over. The old world that I knew for all of 17 years was coming to an end. And I was going to push it off the cliff. And then came the killings at Kent State on May 4th, 1970. So it's still my freshman year. And I'm still all starry-eyed about revolution. And this was how many, 4 students get killed at Kent State on May 4th, 1970. And even though there was no tuition, I was working, such as it was, I was working my way through college. You just get spending money. And so I was working in Manhattan. And I remember on May 5th, on my way to work, hearing people outside the government building where I worked talking about how the students had gotten what they deserved. And I, absolutely flabbergasted. It's always tough when you're young and idealistic to realize there's another side, that there are people who don't think like you. But anyway, back at school, we had also shut down all the school because it was 1970 and it was you're in college, and it was Kent State. And so I was all excited because we're going to mobilize the masses in support of the Cambodian people. Because for me, what mattered was the reason for the demonstration in Kent where people were killed, which was the extension of the war into Cambodia, the bombings of Cambodia. So this was all part of the anti-imperialist struggle. And I'm going to like mobilize the masses at Kingsborough Community College to defend Cambodia. Made sense at the time. So, my friend, my closest friend at the time, also believed like me. He was into left-wing politics for all the right reasons. We weren't opposed to the Vietnam War because we didn't want to be drafted. We opposed the Vietnam War because it was an imperialist war that had to be opposed. Everybody felt that way, we thought. And so I remember Jeff and I marching through a parade of two, marching through the campus, chanting Jeunesse communiste révolutionnaire. Like, what the hell are we talking about? But again, we believed it. And so we gathered around. There was a flagpole where everybody was gathering around and people are giving fiery speeches. And I get up and I talk about the Cambodian people and the fight against Yankee imperialism and defending Cuba and all kinds of stuff. Everybody else is talking about, what are we going to do when the National Guard comes here? Nobody mentioned a word about the war in Vietnam, about the expansion of the war in Vietnam. Everybody was just concerned about, what are we going to do? The National Guard is now going to come and kill us. And all they cared about was their own pathetic existences. And I was only 18. I'd been political for all of 2 years, but the scales fell from my eyes because I realized, and I've never stopped thinking it, and I'm more convinced with it as time goes by, that the anti-war, well, it's the fact, the anti-war movement died when they ended the draft. And whereas I thought that everybody, all these millions of people at demonstrations all across the country were all there for idealistic reasons, they weren't. They were there just for selfish reasons. And it really shook me for a good long while, what I saw on that day. And even though I continued in SDS, and then I was editor of the college newspaper, and I wrote all kinds of insane articles, like when, this was earlier than that, when Fred Hampton was killed in Chicago. And I still have the article where I talk about, the need to kill the pigs, to avenge Fred's death. However, my mama didn't raise no fool. I signed the article F. Bronstein. F for Fidel, Bronstein, Trotsky's real name, but also not hiding the fact that I was a Yid. So there was, my college years politics, because then when after the community college, the first 2 years, I went on for the second 2 years to an experimental school out on Staten Island. And there, all I cared about was film and literature. I needed to retreat from what I saw was, what I felt was just fraudulent politics on the part of my peers. And I just started watching 5 films a day. So politics lay in abeyance for a little bit.
So you left college, and what happened next?
Well, so what had happened was, I hated my environment, as I said. And not least, I just hated all the Jews around me. I just hated it. And I hated Israel. And how I came to that was, amazingly enough, I have to go backwards a little bit. It was when I was probably a sophomore or a junior in high school. And this was sometime after the 6-Day War. And I'd never heard anybody say anything bad about Israel, ever. It was inconceivable. Israel was right in everything it did. But I had a social studies teacher, Mr. Jacobson. who one day in class, I guess we were carrying on about how great Israel was. And he said, the Palestinians have a case. And it was just so shocking. And then he explained a little bit about the injustices done to the Palestinians. And he made perfect sense. And it also fed into my hatred that I was the hatred that I was feeling for everything around me. So, but when I got to my college for the second 2 years, I fell in love. This is how I end up on a left-wing kibbutz in Israel. I fall madly in love with a girl that I met at registration. Okay, I could give her name, but I won't. And I transferred into every one of her classes before school even began. And I was just absolutely head over heels in love with this girl. And I asked her out, and we went out immediately, like the first week of school. And, we went out. I stayed over at her apartment, but just stayed over at her apartment. And then she said, I had to go to work. I'll come back. And she left me home locked in for like 20 hours. And when she came back, she said to me, the only reason I went out with you, Mitch, was because you're a Jew. She wasn't Jewish. I should have said this earlier. She said, my father really hates Jews. She said, if I would go with a black guy, it would be okay, because at least he'd be a Christian. But you know what? This would really, really get to him if he knew I went out with a Jew. And that's why I went out with you. And that was complete revelation. I had no idea that kind of sentiment existed anywhere that I would be. And so it threw me so that really confused me. And so then it sent me into a kind of Jewy tailspin, where all of a sudden I rediscovered, like, when looking for a better form of Jewishness than the one that I had grown up in. And there was a great newspaper called the Brooklyn Bridge. And when I read it, I recognized myself in that. It was Jew, left. And so when I was in college, I got really interested. I have no idea how this is going to happen, in left-wing Zionism. So I decided my college career was ending, I needed to move to Israel and build socialism. So I still had so I went to the Jewish Agency, and I went and I told them I want to go to Israel, and I want to learn Hebrew, and I want you to find me the furthest left kibbutz you can. And so they did. They were really confused. I remember the guy was wearing a yarmulke. Nobody ever walked in and said, give me the furthest left kibbutz. But he did a great job. He found me a fabulous, really hardline, left-wing kibbutz. And so I didn't even go to I never attended my college graduation, because as like the day of the last class, the next day I was on a plane, and I'm going on a kibbutz, and I'm going to like Jewish labor, and I'm going to build socialism. And then the second day that I was cutting down fruit, I said, this is not for me. This is like definitely not for me. I don't know who the hell ever came up with this idea, but this standing out in the heat, and I'm like cutting fruit. For this, I've read books. So I was a disaster. I was an absolute disaster. And so then the kibbutz had to find other things for me to do, because I just could not do fruit. So then they found every job they put me in, I was a disaster at. But I was going to be like a Jewish worker, like straight out of 1906. It made no sense to me. So then they put me to work in a factory, because this kibbutz was really wealthy because it had a furniture factory. It's very famous, Hazareya. And they put me to be the assistant. First, they had me like doing whatever it is where you like cut with on a die in the shape of the furniture. There was nothing. I would spend like a day, and there was nothing but a pile of junk wood on the floor, because there was nothing I could do. So they said, okay, you're going to work with, I think his name was Fauzi. And so I worked with this Palestinian who turned out to be a communist. And it's not uncommon for Palestinians to vote communist because it was the only party that defended Palestinian interests. He was a communist. He even defended Stalin to me. And he said, you know, Stalin, whatever he did it to defend the working class. So here it was, I was working in a factory. Fauzi was a real worker. He was an oppressed worker because he was Palestinian. So I totally shed whatever Zionism I had. And I was going to be an Israeli communist. So, and that was what I did. I got in touch with the Communist Party. I went to the Communist Press Festival there, met Mayor Vilna, who signed the communist who signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence. I even still have the newspaper, me on the front page of Zohar Derech, the communist newspaper. And so I went to demonstrations constantly. I met with all kinds of people. And there was it's too complicated a story, but there was two communist parties in Israel. There was one that was mainly Arab, and there was one that was mainly Jewish. I, of course, was with the mainly Arab one, because I was pro-Soviet. And so, but the other communist party had a kibbutz. And I wanted to say, I contacted them. They invited me to come work there for a week. And the secretary of that kibbutz had been a communist in Germany who had to flee Germany. He had been imprisoned in Germany when Hitler took power, fled to Palestine, where he was imprisoned as a communist by the British. And he had been on the Central Committee of the Israel Communist Party. But on this kibbutz was a member of Matzpen, the Israel Socialist Organization, which was the anti-Zionist, militantly anti-Zionist, no messing around communists in Israel. And so there was a member of Matzpen on the kibbutz. And of course, I gravitated to him. And when he saw that there's finally somebody who would talk to him, he was excited to see me. So we were talking and talking. And every day, and he would tell me his stories. And then one day, the communist who was the secretary of the kibbutz called me over. And I used my Hebrew name when I was there because I was starting a whole new life. So I was Mitch Abidor. And so Eliezer, the communist, said, I need to talk to you, Meir. He said, you really should not be talking to him. And I said, why? He said, because the Shin Bet, the security forces, they're going to be on you. Because if you think that they're not keeping track of everybody he talks to, you're sadly mistaken. And you're looking for trouble if you talk to him. I continued to talk to him. I was only there for a week. Well, jump forward several decades. And I have a girlfriend who's Israeli, whose mother was in the Shin Bet. So she asked her mother to look me up. And, she wasn't I could just infer from what she said that I did indeed have a Shin Bet file for spending time with this Matzpennik. But Israel, so I was very political when I was there, but also what helped my politics was my closest friends were Argentines and Uruguayans. And they were all labor Zionists. But, labor Zionists in Argentina and Uruguay were just this side of ERP and the Montoneros. And they didn't speak any English, and I didn't speak any Spanish. So we all had to learn Hebrew so we could communicate with each other. And they took me under their wing and they taught me songs by the great Daniel Viglietti, the Uruguayan Tupamaros singer. And they told me stories, and they told me about Argentine and Uruguayan leftists who the only way they could escape the death squads, they had been to move to Israel because they were Jews. So they had the right to Israeli citizenship. So Israel not only, completely ended any attraction I might have had to Zionism and to that kind of stuff, It also opened my eyes and my mind to, because now I've actually met, third world radicals, and they were terrific people. And when the death squads were really in motion, and there would be like lists of articles and stories about the disappeared, and I would always look up these guys' names, because if any of them went back, they all would have risked, being among the disappeared. So that was so that was from 70. So I ended up only spending 6 months there, because I had been, however, whatever the problems with my finding a job for me, I was a really hard worker when I worked with this Fauzi. And I learned Hebrew. I was reading Hebrew newspapers, conversing in Hebrew. I was really dedicated. And so the kibbutz invited me to stay on for another 6 months, and then they would place me in whatever kibbutz I wanted to go to. So I said, oh, this is it. My life is set. I'm going to be on a kibbutz. There was one kibbutz in the Negev that was really to the left. And so I said, all right. But then I went home because my sister was getting married. And the story that I always tell is, and this is partially true, was that Israel bombed Lebanon while I was home. I was only going to be home for like a month and then go back to Israel, or for a couple of months. And I said, I can't go back to that, because if I go back to Israel, I have to go into the army. And then I'm going to be complicit in the bombing and all the other wars that are certain to happen. And I couldn't do it. That was an element. But also I had started working for the city just as a way to tide myself over. And to be, if I have to be honest, and I should be, is I like settled into the life of a civil servant, and it wasn't so terrible. So I didn't want to kill Arabs, but I also, I got a job, and that's it. I could settle in here, and 40 years later, come out of it with a nice pension. And there you go.